Hi, welcome back. We're continuing on with Brave New World. We left off last time at the end of chapter 5, so we'd be starting chapter 6 today. And yeah, I want to say something because last time I did some solo commentary and I had remarked on how I thought it was bizarre that this supposed utopia had such a superficial element to just the interpersonal interactions and the inner thoughts of some of our characters, like Bernard. And after some thought, I now realize that I almost got the point. I get it now. I get that this is the commentary that the story is making. So, yeah, after we read these next few chapters, I'm happy to give my incredible commentary on whatever we get through tonight. But for real, please, I've never read this book, nor have I actually really explored its concepts or themes. So this is all first impression for me, and I'm very humbly trying to just encourage some discussion with those of you who are interested. So please forgive me if I say anything that dances around the point. I'm trying. So, shall we get into it? Most of my commentary was in the last episode, but all I can say now is I'm kind of rooting for Bernard. I mean, I find him to be a relatable character. He feels so insecure in the position he's in society, which is being an alpha. And Lenina, she just seems like she's just a young woman who's navigating this particular society with the tools that are her strong suit. And I'm rooting for her too. Yeah, so I think we're still in the middle of world building, but we'll see where these next few chapters take us. Yeah. So why don't we just get into it? Chapter 6. Odd, 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 was Lenina's verdict on Bernard Marx. So odd, indeed, that in the course of the succeeding weeks, she had wondered more than once whether she shouldn't change her mind about the New Mexico holiday and go instead to the North Pole with Benito Hoover. The trouble was that she knew the North Pole, had been there with George Edsel only last summer, and what was more, found it pretty grim. Nothing to do, and the hotel too hopelessly old-fashioned. No television laid on the bed in the bedrooms, no scent organ, only the most putrid synthetic music, and not more than 25 escalator squash courts for over 200 guests. No, decidedly she couldn't face the North Pole again. Added to which, she had only been to America once before, and even then, how inadequately. A cheap weekend in New York had it been with Jean-Jacques Habibullah or Bokanovsky Jones. She couldn't remember. Anyhow, it was of absolutely no importance. The prospect of flying west again, and for a whole week, was very inviting. Moreover, for at least 3 days of that week, they would be in the Savage Reservation. Not more than half a dozen people in the whole center had ever been inside a Savage Reservation. As an Alpha Plus psychologist, Bernard was one of the few men she knew entitled to a permit. For Lenina, the opportunity was unique, and yet so unique was also Bernard's oddness that she had hesitated to take it. had actually thought of risking the pole again with funny old Bonito. At least Benito was normal, whereas Bernard, alcohol in his blood circuit, was Fanny's explanation of every eccentricity. But Henry, with whom, one evening when they were in bed together, Lenina had rather anxiously discussed her new lover, Henry had compared poor Bernard to a rhinoceros. "You can't teach a rhinoceros tricks," he had explained in his brief and vigorous style. "Some men are almost rhinoceroses. They don't respond properly to conditioning. Poor devils. Bernard's one of them. Luckily for him, he's pretty good at his job. Otherwise, the director would have never kept him. However," he added consolingly, "I think he's pretty harmless." Pretty harmless, perhaps, but also pretty disquieting. That mania, to start with, for doing things in private, which meant, in practice, not doing anything at all. For what was there that one could do in private? Apart, of course, from going to bed, but one couldn't do that all the time. Yes, what was there? Precious little. The first afternoon they went out together was particularly fine. Lenina had suggested a swim at the Torquay County Country Club, followed by dinner at the Oxford Union. But Bernard thought that there would be too much of a crowd. Then what about a round of electromagnetic golf at St. Andrews? But again, no. Bernard considered that electromagnetic golf was a waste of time. "Then what's time for?" asked Lenina in some astonishment. Apparently for going walks in the Lake District, for that was what he had now proposed. Land on top of the skiddaw and walk for a couple of hours in the heather. "Alone with you, Lenina." "But, Bernard, we shall be alone all night." Bernard blushed and looked away. "I meant alone for talking," he mumbled. "Talking? But what about?" Walking and talking. That seemed a very odd way of spending an afternoon. In the end, she persuaded him, much against his will, to fly over to Amsterdam to see the semi-demi-finals of the Women's Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. "In a crowd," he grumbled, as usual. He remained obstinately gloomy the whole afternoon, wouldn't talk to Lenina's friends, of whom they met dozens in the ice cream soma bar between the wrestling bouts, and in spite of his misery, absolutely refused to take the half-gram raspberry sundae which she pressed upon him. "I'd rather be myself," he said. "Myself and nasty. Not somebody else, however jolly." "A gram in time saves 9, said Lenina, producing a bright treasure of sleep-taught wisdom. Bernard pushed away the proffered glass impatiently. "Now don't lose your temper," she said. "Remember, 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy sentiments." "Oh, for Ford's sake, be quiet," he shouted. Lenina shrugged her shoulders. "A gram is always better than a dam," she concluded with dignity, and drank the sundae herself. On their way back across the channel, Bernard insisted on stopping his propeller and hovering on his helicopter screws within 100 feet of the waves. The weather had taken a change for the worse. A southwesterly wind had sprung up, the sky was cloudy. "Look," he commanded. "But it's horrible," said Lenina, shrinking back from the windows. She was appalled by the rushing emptiness of the night, by the black foam-flecked water heaving beneath them, by the pale face of the moon, so haggard and distracted among the hastening clouds. "Let's turn on the radio, quick." She reached for the dialing knob on the dashboard and turned it at random. "Skies are blue inside of you," sang 16 tremoloing falsettos. "The weather's always..." Then a hiccough and silence. Bernard had switched off the current. "I want to look at the sea in peace," he said. One can't even look with that beastly noise going on. But it's lovely, and I don't want to look. But I do, he insisted. It makes me feel as though he hesitated, searching for words with which to express himself. As though I were more me, if you see what I mean. More on my own, not so completely a part of something else. Not just a cell in the social body. Doesn't it make you feel like that, Lenina? But Lenina was crying. It's horrible, it's horrible, she kept repeating. And how can you talk like that about not wanting to be a part of the social body? After all, everyone works for everyone else. We can't do without anyone, even epsilons. Yes, I know, said Bernard derisively. Even epsilons are useful. So am I. And I damned well wish I weren't. Lenina was shocked by his blasphemy. Bernard, she protested in a voice of amazed distress. How can you? In a different key. How can I? He repeated meditatively. No, the real problem is, how is it that I can't? Or rather, because after all, I know quite well why I can't. What would it be like if I could? If I were free, not enslaved by my conditioning? But Bernard, you're saying the most awful things. Don't you wish you were free, Lenina? I don't know what you mean. I am free. Free to have the most wonderful time. Everybody's happy nowadays. He laughed. Yes, everybody's happy nowadays. We begin giving the children that at 5. But wouldn't you like to be free, to be happy in some other way, Lenina? In your own way, for example. Not in everybody else's way. I don't know what you mean, she repeated, then turning to him. Oh, do let's go back, Bernard, she besought. I do so hate it here. Don't you like being with me? But of course, Bernard. It's this horrible place. I thought we'd be more together here, with nothing but the sea and moon. More together than in that crowd, or even in my rooms. Don't you understand that? I don't understand anything, she said with decision, determined to preserve her incomprehension intact. Nothing. Least of all, she continued in another tone, why don't you take Soma when you have these dreadful ideas of yours? You'd forget all about them. And instead of feeling miserable, you'd be jolly. So jolly, she repeated and smiled, for all the puzzled anxiety in her eyes, with what was meant to be an inviting and voluptuous cajolery. He looked at her in silence, his face unresponsive and very grave, looked at her intently. After a few seconds, Lenina's eyes flinched away. She uttered a nervous little laugh, tried to think of something to say and couldn't. The silence prolonged itself. When Bernard spoke at last, it was in a small, tired voice. All right then, he said. We'll go back. And stepping hard on the accelerator, he sent the machine rocketing up to the sky. At 4,000, he started his propeller. They flew in silence for a minute or two. Then suddenly, Bernard began to laugh. Rather oddly, Lenina thought, but still, it was laughter. Feeling better? She ventured to ask. For answer, he lifted one hand from the controls and, slipping his arm around her, began to fondle her breasts. Thank Ford, she said to herself. He's all right again. Half an hour later, they were back in his rooms. Bernard swallowed 4 tablets of Soma at a gulp, turned on the radio and television, and began to undress. Well, Lenina inquired with significant archness when they met next afternoon on the roof. Did you think it was fun yesterday? Bernard nodded. They climbed into the plane. A little jolt, and they were off. Everyone says I'm awfully pneumatic, said Lenina reflectively, patting her own legs. Awfully. But there was an expression of pain in Bernard's eyes. Like meat, he was thinking. She looked up with a certain anxiety. But you don't think I'm too plump, do you? He shook his head. Like so much meat. You think I'm all right? Another nod. In every way? Perfect, he said aloud, and inwardly, she thinks of herself that way. She doesn't mind being meat. Lenina smiled triumphantly, but her satisfaction was premature. All the same, he went on after a little pause, I still rather wish it had all ended differently. Differently? Were there other endings? I didn't want it to end with our going to bed, he specified. Lenina was astonished. Not at once, not the first day. But then what? He began to talk a lot of incomprehensible and dangerous nonsense. Lenina did her best to stop the ears of her mind, but every now and then a phrase would insist on becoming audible. To try the effect of arresting my impulses, she heard him say. The words seemed to touch a spring in her mind. Never put off till tomorrow the fun you can have today, she said gravely. 200 repetitions, twice a week, from 14 to 16 and a half, was all his comment. The mad, bad talk rambled on. I want to know what passion is, she heard him saying. I want to feel something strongly. When the individual feels, the community reels, Lenina pronounced. Well, why shouldn't it reel a bit? Bernard! But Bernard remained unabashed. Adults intellectually and during working hours, he went on, infants where feeling and desire are concerned. Our Ford loved infants. Ignoring the interruption, it suddenly struck me the other day, continued Bernard, that it might be possible to be an adult all the time. I don't understand. Lenina's tone was firm. I know you don't. And that's why we went to bed together yesterday, like infants, instead of being adults and waiting. But it was fun, Lenina insisted. Wasn't it? Oh, the greatest fun, he answered, but in a voice so mournful, with an expression so profoundly miserable that Lenina felt all her triumph suddenly evaporate. Perhaps he had found her too plump, after all. I told you so, was all that Fanny said, when Lenina came and made her confidences. It's the alcohol they put in his surrogate. All the same, Lenina insisted, I do like him. He has such awfully nice hands, and the way he moves his shoulders, that's very attractive. She sighed. But I wish he weren't so odd. Halting for a moment outside the door of the director's room, Bernard drew a deep breath and squared his shoulders, bracing himself to meet the dislike and disapproval which he was certain of finding within. He knocked and entered. A permit for you to initial, Director? He said as airily as possible and laid the paper on the writing table. The director glanced at him sourly. But the stamp of the World Controller's office was at the head of the paper, and the signature of Mustafa Mon, bold and black across the bottom. Everything was perfectly in order. The director had no choice. He penciled his initials, 2 small pale letters abject at the feet of Mustafa Mon, and was about to return the paper without a word of comment or genial Ford speed when his eye was caught by something written in the body of the permit. For the New Mexican reservation, he said, and his tone, the face he lifted to Bernard, expressed a kind of agitated astonishment. Surprised by his surprise, Bernard nodded. There was a silence. The director leaned back in his chair, frowning. "How long ago was it?" he said, speaking more to himself than to Bernard. 20 years, I suppose. Nearer 25. I must have been your age." He sighed and shook his head. Bernard felt extremely uncomfortable. A man so conventional, so scrupulously correct as the director, and to commit so gross a solecism, it made him want to hide his face, to run out of the room. Not that he saw himself anything intrinsically objectionable in people talking about the remote past. That was one of those hypnopathic prejudices he had, so he imagined, completely got rid of. What made him feel so shy was the knowledge that the director disapproved and yet had been betrayed into doing the forbidden thing. Under what inward compulsion? Though, through his discomfort, Bernard eagerly listened. "I had the same idea as you," the director was saying. "Wanted to have a look at the savages. Got a permit for New Mexico and went there for my summer holiday. With the girl I was having at the moment. She was a beta minus, and I think," he shut his eyes, "I think she had yellow hair. Anyhow, she was pneumatic. Particularly pneumatic, I remember that. Well, we went there, and we looked at the savages, and we rode about on horses and all that. And then, it was almost the last day of my leave, then, well, she got lost. We'd gone riding up one of those revolting mountains, and it was horribly hot and oppressive, and after lunch we went to sleep. Or at least, I did. She must have gone for a walk alone. At any rate, when I woke up, she wasn't there, and the most frightful thunderstorm I've ever seen was just bursting on us, and it poured and roared and flashed, and the horses broke loose and ran away, and I fell down trying to catch them and hurt my knee so that I could hardly walk. Still, I searched, and I shouted, and I searched, but there was no sign of her. Then I thought she must have gone back to the rest house by herself, so I crawled down into the valley by the way we had come. My knee was agonizingly painful, and I lost my soma. It took me hours. I didn't get back to the rest house till after midnight. And she wasn't there. She wasn't there, the director repeated. There was a silence. "Well," he resumed at last, "the next day there was a search, but we couldn't find her. She must have fallen into a gully somewhere, or been eaten by a mountain lion. Ford knows. Anyhow, it was horrible. It upset me very much at the time. More than it ought to have done, I dare say. Because, after all, it's a sort of accident that might have happened to anyone. And of course, the social body persists although the component cells may change. But this sleep-taught consolation did not seem to be very effective. Shaking his head, "I actually dream about it sometimes," the director went on in a low voice. "Dream of being woken up by that peal of thunder and finding her gone. Dream of searching and searching for her under the trees." He lapsed into the silence of reminiscence. "You must have had a terrible shock," said Bernard, almost enviously. At the sound of his voice, the director started into a guilty realization of where he was, shot a glance at Bernard, and, averting his eyes, blushed darkly, looked at him again with sudden suspicion, and, angrily on his dignity, "Don't imagine," he said, "that I'd had any indecorous relation with that girl. Nothing emotional, nothing long drawn. It was all perfectly healthy and normal." He handed Bernard the permit. "I really don't know why I bored you with this trivial anecdote." Furious with himself for having given away a discreditable secret, he vented his rage on Bernard. The look in his eyes was now frankly malignant. "And I should like to take this opportunity, Mr. Marks," he went on, "of saying that I'm not at all pleased with the reports I receive of your behavior outside working hours. You may say that this is not my business, but it is. I have the good name of the center to think of. My workers must be above suspicion, particularly those of the highest castes. Alphas are so conditioned that they do not have to be infantile in their emotional behavior, but that is all the more reason for their making a special effort to conform. It is their duty to be infantile, even against their inclination. And so, Mr. Marks, I give you fair warning." The director's voice vibrated with an indignation that had now become wholly righteous and impersonal. It was the expression of the disapproval of society itself. "If ever I hear again of any lapse from a proper standard of infantile decorum, I shall ask for your transference to a sub-center, preferably to Iceland. Good morning." And swiveling around in his chair, he picked up his pen and began to write. "That'll teach him," he said to himself. But he was mistaken, for Bernard left the room with a swagger, exulting as he banged the door behind him, in the thought that he stood alone and battled against the order of things, elated by the intoxicating consciousness of his individual significance and importance. Even the thought of persecution left him undismayed, was rather tonic than depressing. He felt strong enough to meet and overcome affliction, strong enough to face even Iceland. And his confidence was the greater for his not for a moment really believing that he would be called upon to face anything at all. People simply weren't transferred for things like that. Iceland was just a threat, a most stimulating and life-giving threat. Walking along the corridor, he actually whistled. Heroic was the account he gave that evening of his interview with the DHC. Whereupon, it concluded, I simply told him to go to the bottomless past and marched out of the room. And that was that. He looked at Helmholtz Watson expectantly, awaiting his due reward of sympathy, encouragement, admiration. But no word came. Helmholtz sat silent, staring at the floor. He liked Bernard. He was grateful to him for being the only man of his acquaintance with whom he could talk about the subjects he felt to be important. Nevertheless, there were things in Bernard which he hated. This boasting, for example, and the outbursts of an abject self-pity with which it alternated, and his deplorable habit of being bold after the event, and full, in absence, of the most extraordinary presence of mind. He hated these things, just because he liked Bernard. The seconds passed. Helmholtz continued to stare at the floor, and suddenly Bernard blushed and turned away. The journey was quite uneventful. The Blue Pacific rocket was 2.5 minutes early at New Orleans, lost 4 minutes in a tornado over Texas, but flew into a favorable air current at longitude 95 west, and was able to land at Santa Fe less than 40 seconds behind schedule time. 40 seconds on a 6.5-hour flight. Not so bad, Lenina conceded. Hi. They slept that night at Santa Fe. The hotel was excellent, incomparably better, for example, than that horrible Aurora Bora palace in which Lenina had suffered so much the previous summer. Liquid air, television, vibro-vacuum massage, radio, boiling caffeine solution, hot contraceptives, and 8 different kinds of scent were laid on in every bedroom. The synthetic music plant was working as they entered the hall and left nothing to be desired. A notice in the lift announced that there were 60 escalator squash racket courts in the hotel, and that obstacle and electromagnetic golf could both be played in the park. But it sounds simply too lovely, cried Lenina. I almost wish we could stay here. 60 escalator squash courts. There won't be any in the reservation, Bernard warned her. And no scent, no television, no hot water even. If you feel you can't stand it, stay here till I come back. Lenina was quite offended. Of course I can stand it. I only said it was lovely here because, well, because progress is lovely, isn't it? 500 repetitions once a week from 13 to 17, said Bernard wearily, as though to himself. What did you say? I said that progress was lovely. That's why you mustn't come to the reservation unless you really want to. But I do want to. Very well then, said Bernard, and it was almost a threat. The permit required the signature of the warden of the reservation, at whose office next morning they duly presented themselves. An Epsilon plus Negro porter took in Bernard's card, and they were admitted almost immediately. The warden was a blonde and brachycephalic alpha minus, short, red, moon-faced, and broad-shouldered, with a loud, booming voice, very well adapted to the utterance of hypnopathic wisdom. He was a mine of irrelevant information and unasked for good advice. Once started, he went on and on, boomingly. 560,000 square kilometers divided into 4 distinct sub-reservations, each surrounded by a high-tension wire fence. At this moment, and for no apparent reason, Bernard suddenly remembered that he had left the eau de cologne tap in this bathroom wide open and running, supplied with current from the Grand Canyon hydroelectric station. Cost me a fortune by the time I get back. With his mind's eye, Bernard saw the needle on the scent meter creeping round and round, ant-like, indefatigably. Quickly telephoned to Helmholtz Watson. Upwards of 5,000 kilometers of fencing at 60,000 volts. You don't say so, said Lenina politely, not knowing in the least what the warden had said, but taking her cue from his dramatic pause. When the warden started booming, she had inconspicuously swallowed half a gram of soma, with the result that she could now sit, serenely not listening, thinking of nothing at all, but with her large blue eyes fixed on the warden's face in an expression of rapt attention. To touch the fence is instant death, pronounced the warden solemnly. There is no escape from a savage reservation. The word escape was suggestive. Perhaps, said Bernard, half rising, we ought to think of going. The little black needle was scurrying, an insect, nibbling through time, eating into his money. No escape, repeated the warden, waving him back into his chair, and as the permit was not yet countersigned, Bernard had no choice but to obey. Those who are born in the reservation, and remember, my dear young lady, he added, leering obscenely at Lenina and speaking in an improper whisper, remember that, in the reservation, children still are born. Yes, actually born, revolting as that may seem. He hoped that this reference to a shameful subject would make Lenina blush, but she only smiled with simulated intelligence and said, You don't say so. Disappointed, the warden began again. Those, I repeat, who are born in the reservation are destined to die there. Destined to die. A deciliter of eau de cologne every minute, 6 liters an hour. Perhaps, Bernard tried again, we ought. Leaning forward, the director tapped the table with his forefinger. You ask me how many people live in the reservation, and I reply, triumphantly, I reply that we do not know. We can only guess. You don't say so. My dear young lady, I do say so. 6 times 24. No, it would be nearer 6 times 36. Bernard was pale and trembling with impatience, but inexorably the booming continued. about 60,000 Indians and half-breeds, absolute savages. Our inspectors occasionally visit, otherwise no communication whatever with the civilized world. Still preserve their repulsive habits and customs, marriage, if you know what that is, my dear young lady, families, no conditioning, monstrous superstitions, Christianity and totemism and ancestor worship, extinct languages such as Zuni and Spanish and Athapascan, pumas, porcupines, and other ferocious animals, infectious diseases, priests, venomous lizards? You don't say so. They got away at last. Bernard dashed to the telephone. Quick, quick, but it took him nearly 3 minutes to get on to Helmholtz Watson. We might be among the savages already, he complained. Damned incompetence. Have a gram, suggested Lenina. He refused, preferring his anger. And at last, thank Ford, he was through, and yes, it was Helmholtz. Helmholtz, to whom he explained what had happened, and who promised to go round at once, and turn off the tap, yes, at once, but took this opportunity to tell him what the DHC had said in public yesterday evening. What? He's looking out for someone to take my place? Bernard's voice was agonized. So it's actually decided. Did he mention Iceland? You say he did? Ford, Iceland. He hung up the receiver and turned back to Lenina. His face was pale, his expression utterly dejected. What's the matter? She asked. The matter? He dropped heavily into a chair. I'm going to be sent to Iceland. Often in the past, he had wondered what it would be like to be subjected, someless and with nothing but his own inward resources to rely on, to some great trial, some pain, some persecution. He had even longed for affliction. As recently as a week ago, in the director's office, he had imagined himself courageously resisting, stoically accepting, suffering without a word. The director's threats had actually elated him, made him feel larger than life. But that, as he now realized, was because he had not taken the threats quite seriously. He had not believed that when it came to the point, the DHC would ever do anything. Now that it looked as though the threats were really to be fulfilled, Bernard was appalled. Of that imagined stoicism, the theoretical courage, not a trace was left. He raged against himself. What a fool! Against the director. How unfair not to give him that other chance which, he now had no doubt at all, he had always intended to take. And Iceland. Lenina shook her head. Was and will make me ill, she quoted. I take a gram and only am. In the end, she persuaded him to swallow 4 tablets of soma. 5 minutes later, roots and fruits were abolished. The flower of the present rosily blossomed. A message from the porter announced that, at the warden's orders, a reservation guard had come around with a plane and was waiting on the roof of the hotel. They went up at once. An octoroon in gamma green uniform saluted and proceeded to recite this morning's program. A bird's eye view of 10 or a dozen of the principal pueblos, then a landing for lunch in the valley of Malpay. The rest house was comfortable there, and up at the pueblo, the savages would probably be celebrating their summer festival. It would be the best place to spend the night. They took their seats in the plane and set off. 10 minutes later, they were crossing the frontier that separated civilization from savagery. Uphill and down, across the deserts of salt or sand, through forests, into the violet depths of canyons, over crag and peak and table-topped mesa, The fence marched on, irresistibly the straight line, the geometrical symbol of triumphant human purpose, and at its foot, here and there, a mosaic of white bones. A still unrotted carcass, dark on the tawny ground, marked the place where deer or steer, puma or porcupine or coyote, or the greedy turkey buzzards, drawn down by the whiff of carrion and fulminated as though by a poetic justice, had come too close to the destroying wires. "They never learn," said the green uniformed pilot, pointing down at the skeletons on the ground below them. "And they never will learn," he added and laughed, as though he had somehow scored a personal triumph over the electrocuted animals. Bernard also laughed. After 2 grams of soma, the joke seemed, for some reason, good. Laughed, and then, almost immediately, dropped off to sleep, and sleeping, was carried over Taos and Tesuke, over Nambe and Picuris, and Pojoake, over Saya and Cochiti, over Laguna and Acoma and the Enchanted Mesa, over Zuni and Cibola and Ojo Caliente, and woke at last to find the machine standing on the ground, Lenina carrying the suitcases into a small square house, and the gamma green octoroon talking incomprehensibly with a young Indian. "Malpais," explained the pilot as Bernard stepped out. "This is the rest house, and there's a dance this afternoon at the Pueblo. He'll take you there." He pointed to the sullen young savage. "Funny, I expect," he grinned. "Everything they do is funny." And with that, he climbed into the plane and started up the engines. "Back tomorrow. And remember," he added reassuringly to Lenina, "they're perfectly tame. Savages won't do you any harm. They've got enough experience of gas bombs to know that they mustn't play any tricks." Still laughing, he threw the helicopter screws into gear, accelerated, and was gone. Chapter 7. The mesa was like a ship becalmed in a strait of lion-colored dust. The channel wound between precipitous banks, and slanting down from one wall to the other, across the valley, ran a streak of green, the river and its fields. On the prow of that stone ship in the center of the strait, and seemingly a part of it, a shaped and geometrical outcrop of the naked rock, stood the Pueblo of Malpais. Block above block, each story smaller than the one below, the tall houses rose like stepped and amputated pyramids into the blue sky. At their feet lay a straggle of low buildings, a crisscross of walls, and on 3 sides the precipices fell sheer into the plain. A few columns of smoke mounted perpendicularly into the windless air and were lost. "Queer," said Lenina. "Very queer." It was her ordinary word of condemnation. "I don't like it. And I don't like that man." She pointed to the Indian guide who had been appointed to take them up to the Pueblo. Her feeling was evidently reciprocated. The very back of the man, as he walked along before them, was hostile, sullenly contemptuous. "Besides," she lowered her voice, "he smells." Bernard did not attempt to deny it. They walked on. Suddenly, it was as though the whole air had come alive and were pulsing with the indefatigable movement of blood. Up there in Malpais, the drums were being beaten. Their feet fell in with the rhythm of that mysterious heart. They quickened their pace. Their path led them to the foot of the precipice. The sides of the great mesa ship towered over them, 300 feet to the gunwale. "I wish we could have brought the plane," said Lenina, looking up resentfully at the blank, impending rock face. "I hate walking, and you feel so small when you're on the ground at the bottom of a hill." They walked along for some way in the shadow of the mesa, rounded a projection, and there, in a water-worn ravine, was the way up the companion ladder. They climbed. It was a very steep path that zigzagged from side to side of the gully. Sometimes the pulsing of the drums was all but inaudible. At others, they seemed to be beating only just around the corner. When they were halfway up, an eagle flew past so close to them that the wind of his wings blew chill on their faces. In a crevice of the rock lay a pile of bones. It was all oppressively queer, and the Indians smelt stronger and stronger. They emerged at last from the ravine into the full sunlight. The top of the mesa was a flat deck of stone. "Like the Charing T Tower," was Lenina's comment. She was not allowed to enjoy her discovery of this reassuring resemblance for long. A padding of soft feet made them turn around. Naked from the throat to the navel, their dark brown bodies painted with white lines, like asphalt tennis courts, Lenina was later to explain. Their faces inhuman, with daubings of scarlet, black, and ochre. Two Indians came running along the path. Their black hair was braided with fox fur and red flannel. Cloaks of turkey feathers fluttered from their shoulders. Huge feather diadems exploded gaudily around their heads. With every step they took, they came the clink and rattle of their silver bracelets, their heavy necklaces of bone and turquoise beads. They came on without a word, running quietly in their deerskin moccasins. One of them was holding a feather brush. The other carried, in either hand, what looked at a distance like 3 or 4 pieces of thick rope. One of the ropes writhed uneasily, and suddenly Lenina saw that they were snakes. The men came nearer and nearer. Their dark eyes looked at her, but without giving any sign of recognition, any smallest sign that they had seen her or were aware of her existence. The writhing snake hung limp again with the rest. The men passed. "I don't like it," said Lenina. "I don't like it." She liked even less what awaited her at the entrance to the pueblo, where the guide had left them while he went inside for instructions. The dirt, to start with, the piles of rubbish, the dust, the dogs, the flies. Her face wrinkled up into a grimace of disgust. She held her handkerchief to her nose. "But how can they live like this?" she broke out in a voice of indignant incredulity. It wasn't possible. Bernard shrugged his shoulders philosophically. "Anyhow," he said, "they've been doing it for the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, so I suppose they must be used to it by now." "But cleanliness is next to fortliness," she insisted. "Yes, and civilization is sterilization," Bernard went on, concluding on a tone of irony the second hypnopaic lesson in elementary hygiene. "But these people have never heard of our Ford, and they aren't civilized, so there's no point in—" "Oh," she gripped his arm. "Look." An almost naked Indian was very slowly climbing down the ladder from the first-floor terrace of a neighboring house, rung after rung with the tremulous caution of extreme old age. His face was profoundly wrinkled and black, like a mask of obsidian. The toothless mouth had fallen in. At the corners of the lips and on each side of the chin, a few long bristles gleamed almost white against the dark skin. The long, unbraided hair hung down in gray wisps around his face. His body was bent and emaciated to the bone, almost fleshless. Very slowly he came down, pausing at each rung before he ventured another step. "What's the matter with him?" whispered Lenina. Her eyes were wide with horror and amazement. "He's old, that's all," Bernard answered as carelessly as he could. He too was startled, but he made an effort to seem unmoved. "Old?" she repeated. "But the director's old." "Lots of people are old. They're not like that." "That's because we don't allow them to be like that. We preserve them from diseases. We keep their internal secretions artificially balanced at a youthful equilibrium. We don't permit their magnesium-calcium ratio to fall below what it was at 30. We give them transfusions of young blood. We give their metabolism permanently stimulated. So, of course, they don't look like that. Partly," he added, "because most of them die long before they reach this old creature's age. Youth almost unimpaired till 60, and then crack, the end." But Lenina was not listening. She was watching the old man. Slowly, slowly he came down. His feet touched the ground. He turned. In their deep sunken orbits, his eyes were still extraordinarily bright. They looked at her for a long moment expressionlessly, without surprise, as though she had not been there at all. Then slowly, with bent back, the old man hobbled past them and was gone. "But it's terrible," Lenina whispered. "It's awful. We ought not to have come here." She felt in her pocket for her soma, only to discover that, by some unprecedented oversight, she had left the bottle down at the rest house. Bernard's pockets were also empty. Lenina was left to face the horrors of Malpais unaided. They came crowding in on her thick and fast. The spectacle of two young women giving the breast to their babies made her blush and turn away her face. She had never seen anything so indecent in her life. And what made it worse was that, instead of tactfully ignoring it, Bernard proceeded to make open comments on this revoltingly viviparous scene. Ashamed, now that the effects of the soma had worn off, of the weakness he had displayed that morning in the hotel, he went out of his way to show himself a strong and unorthodox. "What a wonderfully intimate relationship," he said, deliberately outrageous. "And what an intensity of feeling it must generate. I often think one may have missed something in not having had a mother. And perhaps you've missed something in not being a mother, Lenina. Imagine yourself sitting there with a little baby of your own." "Bernard, how can you?" The passage of an old woman with ophthalmia and the disease of the skin distracted her from her indignation. "Let's go away," she begged. "I don't like it." But at this moment their guide came back and, beckoning them to follow, led the way down the narrow street between the houses. They rounded a corner. A dead dog was lying on a rubbish heap. A woman with a goiter was looking for lice in the hair of a small girl. Their guide halted at the foot of a ladder, raised his hand perpendicularly, then darted it horizontally forward. They did what he mutely commanded, climbed the ladder and walked through the doorway, to which it gave access, into a long, narrow room, rather dark and smelling of smoke and cooked grease and long-worn, long-unwashed clothes. At the further end of the room was another doorway, through which came a shaft of sunlight and the noise, very loud and close, of the drums. They stepped across the threshold and found themselves on a wide terrace. Below them, shut in by the tall houses, was the village square, crowded with Indians. Bright blankets and feathers and black hair, and the glint of turquoise and dark skins shining with heat. Lenina put her handkerchief to her nose again. In the open space at the center of the square were two circular platforms of masonry and trampled clay. The roofs, it was evident, of underground chambers, for in the center of each platform was an open hatchway, with a ladder emerging from the lower darkness. A sound of subterranean flute playing came up and was almost lost in the steady, remorseless persistence of the drums. Lenina liked the drums. Shutting her eyes, she abandoned herself to their soft, repeated thunder, allowed it to invade her consciousness more and more completely, till at last there was nothing left in the world but that one deep pulse of sound. It reminded her reassuringly of the synthetic noises made at solidarity services and Ford's Day celebrations. "Orgy porgy," she whispered to herself. "These drums beat out just the same rhythms." There was a sudden startling burst of singing. Hundreds of male voices crying out fiercely in harsh metallic unison. A few long notes in silence, the thunderous silence of the drums, then shrill, in a neighing treble. The women's answer. Then again the drums, and once more the men's deep, savage affirmation of their manhood. Queer? Yes. The place was queer. So was the music. So were the clothes and the goiters and the skin diseases and the old people. But the performance itself, there seemed to be nothing specially queer about that. "It reminds me of a lower caste community sing," she told Bernard. But a little later, it was reminding her a good deal less of that innocuous function. For suddenly there had swarmed up from those round chambers underground a ghastly troop of monsters, hideously masked or painted out of all semblance of humanity. They had tramped out a strange limping dance round the square, round and again round, singing as they went, round and round, each time a little faster, and the drums had changed and quickened their rhythm, so that it became like the pulsing of fever in the ears, and the crowd had begun to sing with the dancers, louder and louder. The first one woman had shrieked, and then another, as though they were being killed. And then suddenly, the leader of the dancers broke out of the line, ran to a big wooden chest which was standing at one end of the square, raised the lid, and pulled out a pair of black snakes. A great yell went up from the crowd, and all the other dancers ran towards him with outstretched hands. He tossed the snakes to the first comers, then dipped back into the chest for more and more black snakes, and brown and mottled. He flung them out, and then the dance began again on a different rhythm. Round and round they went with their snakes, snakily, with a soft undulating movement at the knees and hips, round and round. Then the leader gave a signal, and one after another, all the snakes were flung down in the middle of the square. An old man came up from underground and sprinkled them with cornmeal, and from the other hatchway came a woman and sprinkled them with water from a black jar. Then the old man lifted his hand and, startlingly, terrifyingly, there was absolute silence. The drums stopped beating. Life seemed to have come to an end. The old man pointed towards the two hatchways that gave entrance to the lower world, and slowly, raised by invisible hands from below, there emerged from the one a painted image of an eagle, from the other that of a man, naked and nailed to a cross. They hung there, seemingly self-sustained, as though watching. The old man clapped his hands. Naked, but for a white cotton breechcloth, a boy of about 18 stepped out of the crowd and stood before him, his hands crossed over his chest, his head bowed. The old man made the sign of the cross over him and turned away. Slowly, the boy began to walk round the writhing heap of snakes. He had completed the first circuit and was halfway through the second when, from among the dancers, a tall man wearing the mask of a coyote and holding in his hand a whip of plaited leather, advanced towards him. The boy moved on, as though unaware of the other's existence. The coyote man raised his whip. There was a long moment of expectancy, then a swift movement, the whistle of the lash and its loud, flat-sounding impact on the flesh. The boy's body quivered, but he made no sound. He walked on at the same slow, steady pace. The coyote struck again, and at every blow, at first, a gasp and then a deep groan went up from the crowd. The boy walked on. Twice, thrice, 4 times around he went. The blood was streaming. 5 times round, 6 times round. Suddenly, Lenina covered her face with her hands and began to sob. "Oh, stop them, she implored. But the whip fell and fell inexorably. 7 times round. Then all at once the boy staggered and, still without a sound, pitched forward onto his face. Bending over him, the old man touched his back with a long white feather, held it up for a moment, crimson for the people to see, then shook it thrice over the snakes. A few drops fell, and suddenly the drums broke out again into a panic of hurrying notes. There was a great shout. The dancers rushed forward, picked up the snakes, and ran out of the square. Men, women, children, all the crowd ran after them. A minute later, the square was empty. Only the boy remained, prone where he had fallen, quite still. 3 old women came out of one of the houses and with some difficulty lifted him and carried him in. The eagle and the man on the cross kept guard for a little while over the empty pueblo, then, as though they had seen enough, sank slowly down through their hatchways, out of sight into the nether world. Lenina was still sobbing. "Too awful," she kept repeating, and all Bernard's consolations were in vain. "Too awful. That blood," she shuddered. "Oh, I wish I had my soma." That was the sound of feet in the inner room. Lenina did not move, but sat with her face in her hands, unseeing, apart. Only Bernard turned around. The dress of the young man who now stepped out onto the terrace was Indian, but his plaited hair was straw-colored, his eyes pale blue, and his skin a white skin, bronzed. "Hello, good morrow," said the stranger in faultless but peculiar English. "You're civilized, aren't you? You come from the other place, outside the reservation?" "Who on earth?" Bernard began in astonishment. The young man sighed and shook his head. "A most unhappy gentleman." And, pointing to the bloodstains in the center of the square, "Do you see that damned spot?" he asked in a voice that trembled with emotion. "A gram is better than a dam," said Lenina mechanically from behind her hands. "I wish I had my soma." "I ought to have been there," the young man went on. "Why wouldn't they let me be the sacrifice? I'd have gone round 10 times, 12, 15. Palawitwa only got as far as 7. They could have had twice as much blood from me. The multitudinous seas incarnadine." He flung out his arms in a lavish gesture, then despairingly let them fall again. But they wouldn't let me. They disliked me for my complexion. It's always been like that. Always. Tears stood in the young man's eyes. He was ashamed and turned away. Astonishment made Lenina forget the deprivation of soma. She uncovered her face and for the first time looked at the stranger. "Do you mean to say you wanted to be hit with that whip?" Still averted from her, the young man made a sign of affirmation. For the sake of the pueblo, to make the rain come and the corn grow, and to please Pukong and Jesus, and then to show that I can bear pain without crying out. Yes. And his voice suddenly took on a new resonance. He turned with a proud squaring of the shoulders, a proud, defiant lifting of the chin. To show that I am a man, He gave a gasp and was silent, gaping. He had seen, for the first time in his life, the face of a girl whose cheeks were not the color of chocolate or dog skin, whose hair was auburn and permanently waved, and whose expression, amazing novelty, was one of benevolent interest. Lenina was smiling at him. Such a nice-looking boy, she was thinking, and a really beautiful body. The blood rushed up into the young man's face. He dropped his eyes, raised them again for a moment, only to find her still smiling at him, and was so much overcome that he had to turn away and pretend to be looking very hard at something on the other side of the square. Bernard's questions made a diversion. Who, how, when, from where? Keeping his eyes fixed on Bernard's face, for so passionately did he long to see Lenina smiling that he simply dared not to look at her, the young man tried to explain himself. Linda and he, Linda was his mother, the word made Lenina look uncomfortable, were strangers in the reservation. Linda had come from the other place long ago, before he was born, with a man who was his father. Bernard pricked up his ears. She had gone walking alone in these mountains over there to the north, had fallen down a steep place and hurt her head. Go on, said Bernard excitedly. Some hunters from Malpais had found her and brought her into the pueblo. As for the man who was his father, Linda had never seen him again. His name was Tomakin. Yes, Thomas was the DHC's first name. He must have flown away, back to the other place, away, without her, a bad, unkind, unnatural man. And so I was born in Malpais, he concluded. I'm in Malpais, and he shook his head. The squalor of that little house on the outskirts of the pueblo. A space of dust and rubbish separated it from the village. 2 famine-stricken dogs were nosing obscenely in the garbage at its door. Inside, when they entered, the twilight stank and was loud with flies. Linda, the young man called. From the inner room, a rather hoarse female voice said, Coming. They waited. In bowls on the floor were the remains of a meal, perhaps of several meals. The door opened. A very stout, blonde squaw stepped across the threshold and stood looking at the strangers, staring incredulously, her mouth open. Lenina noticed with disgust that 2 of the front teeth were missing. In the color of the ones that remained, she shuddered. It was worse than the old man, so fat, and all the lines in her face, the flabbiness, the wrinkles, and the sagging cheeks, with those purplish blotches, and the red veins on her nose, the bloodshot eyes, and that neck, and the blanket she wore over her head, ragged and filthy. And under the brown sack-shaped tunic, those enormous breasts, the bulge of the stomach, the hips. Much worse than the old man, much worse. And suddenly, the creature burst out into a torrent of speech, rushed at her with outstretched arms, and Ford, it was too revolting. In another moment she'd be sick, pressed her against the bulge, the bosom, and began to kiss her. Ford. To kiss, slobberingly, and smelt too horrible. Obviously never had a bath, and simply reeked of that beastly stuff that was put into Delta and Epsilon bottles. No, it wasn't true about Bernard. Positively stank of alcohol. She broke away as quickly as she could. A blubbered and distorted face confronted her. The creature was crying. Oh, my dear, my dear. The torrent of words flowed sobbingly. If you knew how glad, after all these years, a civilized face, yes, in civilized clothes, because I thought I should never see a piece of real acetate silk again. She fingered the sleeve of Lenina's shirt. The nails were black. And those adorable viscose velveteen shorts. Do you know, dear, I've still got my old clothes, the ones I came in, put away in a box. I'll show you them afterwards. Though, of course, the acetate has all gone into holes. But such a lovely white bandolier. Though I must say your green Morocco is even lovelier. Not that it did me much good, that bandolier. Her tears began to flow again. I suppose John told you what I had to suffer, and not a gram of soma to be had. Only a drink of mezcal every now and then, when Pope used to bring it. Pope is a boy I used to know. But it makes you feel so bad afterwards, the mezcal does, and you're sick with the peyote. Besides, it always made that awful feeling of being ashamed much worse the next day. And I was so ashamed. Just think of it, me, a beta, having a baby. Put yourself in my place. The mere suggestion made Lenina shudder. Though it wasn't my fault, I swear, because I still don't know how it happened, seeing that I did all the Malthusian drill, by numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Always, I swear it. But all the same, it happened. And of course there wasn't anything like an abortion center here. Is it still down in Chelsea, by the way? She asked. Lenina nodded. And still floodlighted on Tuesdays and Fridays? Lenina nodded again. That lovely pink glass tower? Poor Linda lifted her face and with closed eyes ecstatically contemplated that bright, remembered image. And the river at night, she whispered. Great tears oozed slowly out from between her tight-shut eyelids. And flying back in the evening from Stoke Pogues, and then a hot bath and vibro vacuum massage. But there, she drew a deep breath, shook her head, opened her eyes again, sniffed once or twice, then blew her nose on her fingers and wiped them on the skirt of her tunic. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said in a response to Lenina's involuntary grimace of disgust. I oughtn't to have done that, I'm sorry. But what are you to do when there aren't any handkerchiefs? I remember how it used to upset me, all that dirt and nothing being aseptic. I had an awful cut on my head when they first brought me here. You can't imagine what they used to put on it. Filth. Just filth. Civilization is sterilization, I used to say to them. And streptococcus G and Tabanberry tea. To see a fine bathroom and WC. As though they were children. But of course they didn't understand. How should they? And in the end, I suppose I got used to it. And anyhow, how can you keep things clean when there isn't hot water laid on? And look at these clothes. This beastly wool isn't like acetate. It lasts and lasts. And you're supposed to mend it if it gets torn. But I'm a beta. I worked in the fertilizing room. Nobody ever taught me to do anything like that. It wasn't my business. Besides, it never used to be right to mend clothes. Throw them away when they've got holes in them and buy new. The more stitches, the less riches. Isn't that right? Mending's antisocial. But it's all different here. It's like living with lunatics. Everything they do is mad. She looked around, saw John and Bernard had left them and were walking up and down in the dust and garbage outside the house, but nonetheless confidentially lowering her voice and leaning, while Lenina stiffened and shrank, so close that the blown reek of embryo poison stirred the hair on her cheek. For instance, she hoarsely whispered, "Take the way they have one another here." Mad, I tell you, absolutely mad. Everybody belongs to everyone else, don't they? Don't they? She insisted, tugging at Lenina's sleeve. Lenina nodded her averted head, let out the breath she had been holding, and managed to draw another one, relatively untainted. Well, here, the other went on. Nobody's supposed to nobody's supposed to belong to more than one person. And if you have people in the ordinary way, the others think you're wicked and antisocial. They hate and despise you. Once a lot of women came and made a scene because their men came to see me. Well, why not? And then they rushed at me. No, it was too awful. I can't tell you about it. Linda covered her face with her hands and shuddered. They're so hateful, the women here. Mad, mad and cruel. And of course, they don't know anything about Malthusian drill or bottles or decanting or anything of that sort. So they're having children all the time like dogs. It's too revolting. And to think that Ford. And yet John was a great comfort to me. I didn't know what I should have done without him, even though he did get so upset whenever a man, quite as a tiny boy even, once, but that was when he was bigger, he tried to kill poor Waihusiwa, or was it Pope? Just because I used to have them sometimes. Because I never could make him understand that that was what civilized people ought to do. Being mad's infectious, I believe. Anyhow, John seems to have caught it from the Indians, because of course he was with them a lot, even though they were always so beastly to him and wouldn't let him do all the things the other boys did, which was a good thing in a way, because it made it easier for me to condition him a little. Though you've no idea how difficult that is. There's so much one doesn't know. It wasn't my business to know. I mean, when a child asks you how a helicopter works, or who made the world, well, what are you to answer if you're a beta and have always worked in the fertilizing room? What are you to answer? And that's the end of chapter 7. I think I'm going to stop before starting chapter 8 because I'm kind of dozing off. But I'm surprised at the direction this has taken. I'm going to reiterate that I've never read this book and I've never explored any of its concepts or discussion or anything. So please take my humble assessment. I like to just encourage a little bit of discussion afterwards, either with a comment or just a message is fine. But anyways, yeah, so I am excited in the direction it's going. I like that there was so much world building done to build this ice cold utilitarian utopia with, its own caste system. Everything's incredibly futuristic, organized, and now we get to juxtapose it with a savage reservation. And I'm hoping it starts to go in the direction that I immediately thought it would go, which is, the sharing of cultures almost, and maybe the appreciation of how things are free on the reservation. But we'll see, because this is a very stark contrast for Bernard and Lenina, but Lenina is entertaining with her reactions, and Bernard, it's hard for me to really predict where Bernard's character, how he will develop, because he's such a wild thinker, but he is shackled by many influential aspects of this world, utopian world. What is it called? The world state or something? He is shackled by wanting to belong and wanting to fit in, and he's a little bit worried about rocking the boat, having to go to Iceland. He does enjoy being in Lena's company, even though they're very completely different. So I'm interested in seeing how his character develops, because he's so close to the edge of just being completely radical. But I don't know how it's gonna go. Lenina, oh, I would kill for some character development, but so far she's completely entertaining to me. And I don't know, I like the exchange between her and that what did they call him? Like a hybrid, the Indian boy. So this is exciting. Probably gonna do the next couple chapters tomorrow night around the same time. So if you'd like, you can tune in to that. And as always, I post the VODs on YouTube, and I started adding chapters because I do meander a little bit with these intros and outros. So thank you for anybody who's joined and watched, and I really appreciate it. And I hope you got some value either from the reading or even relaxing. So I hope you have a good one, whether it's a good day or good night. I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.